Hey, hey, welcome to the Summit Host Hangout podcast, where you'll learn how to host a high converting virtual summit that leads to your biggest signature offer launch yet. I'm your host, Krista from Summit in a Box, and I have an episode that I thought a lot of you would appreciate today. And I'm going to share my top virtual summit fails. And I don't have any fancy strategy or reasoning behind this episode. I'm not flipping it around to be like, hire me so you don't do these things. I mean, you can. That'd be great. But I just really want to show you that I mess stuff up a lot too. And I see people be so hard on themselves when they're hosting a summit and something doesn't go perfectly that I'm hoping hearing a little bit about some of my biggest failures just helps you go a little bit easier on yourself and know that it's a process for everybody. Also because I just want to keep things real around here. It's easy for me to come on here each week and share the big wins and strategies that I know work, but it's not very often that I get to peel back the curtain and share the real side of things that didn't go so well. And really, there are a lot of those things, but also as someone who teaches summits, I do take it upon myself to do a lot of experimenting. I want to stay at the forefront of trends and strategies so I can teach our students and clients those things as well. And a lot of the time that means trying something totally new. And as you know, new things don't always work. And I'm going to share some of those things with you today. Also, keep in mind that there are a lot of little fails in my summit history. Tech that decided not to work, responses to customer service inquiries that I probably should not have sent, and just things that didn't go according to plan. But in this episode, I'm going to focus on bigger picture strategies. Just because that's what made the most sense. And also those are the things that stand out more in my mind, right? I don't necessarily remember little emails or little tech glitches, but these bigger things are easy to think about. And these are bigger decisions I made and things I tried for the sake of improving numbers that just didn't quite pan out the way I expected. And I'm sure there will be more of them. So to give you a sneak peek, I have 5 or 6 things I'm planning to talk about, including topics related to pitching, big name speakers, things related to sponsors, launching a mini summit, all kinds of good stuff. So let's dive in. So my first and most notable summit fail was the second summit I ever hosted. And a few of you might have heard me talk about it before if you kind of follow me in all the places, but I don't talk about it much because it did not go well. And it was very hard for me because at the same time that I was hosting that summit, I was also launching this brand, Summit in a Box. So you can imagine the imposter syndrome that went into that. Oh, I just hosted an event that didn't go that well. Who am I to be teaching this? But so many people were like, no, we want this from you, that I kind of did anyways. And there were also just things related to the strategy that let me know oh, okay, these changes I made didn't work. It's not I don't necessarily know what I'm doing. So I'll tell you a little bit about it. So my first summit I hosted, it went very well, so much better than I ever expected. And I was like, I am doing that again. I need to do that again as soon as possible. But I do not want to reach out to 20 plus speakers again so soon. I don't know who to pitch. It's an exhausting part of the process for me. I just want it to be easier, was kind of my thought process. So my solution was to, instead of bringing on 20-ish speakers, I was going to bring on 4 plus me, so 5 total. And I was still going to keep it a 5-day event. I positioned it as an implementation week. So each day there was one speaker, one pre-recorded session in the morning. And then we would do, I think we had co-working session or one co-working session a day, later on in the day. And the idea was they would actually be taking action on their business that week. And I thought it sounded great. Now I can look back and see all the reasons that didn't work. But it was a big surprise to me going from my first summit bringing in 1,500 people to the second bringing in, I don't remember exactly how many. It was 300 or 500 or something like that, much smaller and significantly less revenue. I want to say $3,000 is maybe what we brought in through that. And yeah, it felt like a huge failure at the time. Did not meet my expectations. And I did go back then and then the next summit, repeated the strategies from the first one, made some improvements, and was able to boost the results up again from that first summit even. That second one did not go well. So if you are thinking of hosting your summit and experimenting, I get asked about mini summits a lot. What if I host a mini summit or a one-day summit? And I'm always like, you can, but here were my results with it. Did it work? Yeah. I still, grew my list by a few hundred people, generated some revenue, some awareness, things like that. But the results just weren't comparable to like a full blown summit. I would say that this failure is the one I learned the most from. I get to pull from that experience all the time with coaching clients and making decisions and things like that. So while it was really rough at the time, I'm really glad it happened because I learned so much from it. And I think that it's always nice to be able to look back at our failures and then be able to be like, oh, it was actually a win. I just didn't know that at the time. So that was my first one. Fail number 2 was launching a brand new service through a summit. And if you've been around a while, you've heard me talking about launching through summits, you've probably heard me say, really, anytime I talk about launching through a summit, the little disclaimer, like, this should be a proven offer. And I say that for a reason, because I tried using a summit to launch something brand new and it didn't work. And like, it wasn't totally devastating for me because my summit was still a success. I had hosted the summit 2 or 3 times before that. So like the summit itself was easier. So it wasn't like I was doing this whole summit from scratch, making this whole new service from scratch, launching it all, and like it all flopped. The summit still worked, but 0 people took me up on the service. And I don't remember exactly what summit that was, but it was either the one where I had 2,000 people or 4,500 people signed up. So like pretty decent sample size. None went for it. And there definitely would have been easier ways to test to see if that offer worked than making all the sale. I had 3 sales pages for it, I think, because I had like 3 different tiers. I had set up all the contracts and forms and automations. Like I put way too much work into a new service and then like put together a summit on top of it. So yeah, that was a big failure. And that's a big part of why I really don't recommend launching a first-time summit and a new offer at the same time. Now, if you're someone who, like me, has run summits before, you know the drill, and you just kind of want to test something new behind it, and you know that it might not work because the offer isn't proven, that's great. But I never want to see someone launch something new, it not work, and then be like, summits are crap, they don't work. It's like, no, your offer didn't work or your positioning didn't work. There's an issue with it. So it's always good to test before running a summit. All right, let's move on to number 3. My third fail was not a fun one. It was reaching out to big companies as sponsors. So this was actually for the biggest summit I ever hosted. It was a summit we have 6,500 people signed up and it brought in 121,000 in sales. And I was running Summit in a Box at the time. So I always feel pressure. Whenever I do a summit, I feel pressure to like stay on the cutting edge, try new things, make it really impressive so that people who learn from me who are looking are like, okay, yeah, that's good. And so I'd be like, what is she doing? Why isn't she doing this? You know, I feel like everyone's looking at me under a microscope when I do a summit, which I know some people are. So I had never had sponsors prior to the summit, and I felt like I probably should. One, so I could teach that strategy and what worked and what didn't to my people, and also just like to kind of up-level my event. My event was proven. It was great. People loved it. It was well known in the industry. I was like, why not? These companies would honestly be lucky to sponsor. So I reached out to some pretty big name tech companies who I still think should have said yes, but they all just shut me right on down. Lots of them didn't answer, which is very common when you're reaching out to sponsors, especially when you don't have a contact. I had one say that they wouldn't sponsor because I didn't actually use their software, even though my audience does. I had like survey results saying that so many of them did use it. They said they could give me $100 for like my highest tier sponsorship. I was like, okay, thanks, bye. And then another company, I got on the phone with them. We had a great call. They were so excited. I sent them the price and they were like, oh, I have to pay for this? I thought this was free. No, I'm not going to pay for that. I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I have all this experience, these perfect fit people. I have so many ideas for how we could work you into the event, and they just shut me on down. So that was definitely a fail. Luckily, I've learned a lot about sponsorship since then. I have found strategies that work much better for me, both reaching out to bigger companies like that. I haven't done that for my own summits, but I did it for a client summit we produced and saw much more success. And then also, I have a strategy I teach in our Launch with a Summit Accelerator program called Aligned Sponsorships, where I'm reaching out to people who are much more aligned with me, run similar businesses, and just really customizing the process and the way I pitch them. And it just works much better. So I don't remember if it was that same summit or the next one where I did the aligned sponsorship approach and lined up $12,000 in sponsorship. So I went from 0 trying to reach out to these big companies for the first time to $12,000 when I switched to an approach that worked better for me. Reaching out to those big companies was definitely a fail and not a very fun one. All right, next up, kind of similar, another sponsorship related one. But in one of my more recent summits, I just didn't want to go through the work of, creating this fancy pitch deck, having to get on calls with people. I just didn't want to do it. But I did have some companies and friends I wanted to support. So instead of having them pay me a sponsorship fee, I used affiliate links whenever I talked about them. And it was a total fail. I don't know if I made a single affiliate commission through that. And I think there were a couple reasons. Probably the biggest one being I was a slacker, right? Because they didn't pay me. So I didn't have a fire lit under me like I would have to promote them well, like I would have if it was like a paying sponsorship. And I don't know, it just didn't work. And, it's possible that sales came in through that after my cookies expired. And maybe some sales did come in. I just don't know about it because I honestly do not look at the commissions I make very often. I have a team member that does that. But I would say that just didn't work that well for me. I do think I would do it again with companies that are just much more aligned to I'm willing to go all out for in promotion and in incorporating them in the event. I also think it's okay to do if there are companies, people, software you want to feature that is truly just like, you guys should know about this. Here's my affiliate link. Great. But if you are using it as a strategy where you actually want to make significant revenue, you need to be really strategic about it. Or I would just recommend going for the more traditional sponsorship approach. All right, let's move into fail number 5. And this one, I actually recorded podcast episodes going through this entire summit. And I don't remember exactly which episode I talked about it in. It's either 165 or 166, where I was sharing behind the scenes of my summit. And I probably also did a little recap of it in episode 176, where I shared the results of that summit. But this was a summit I hosted for Summit in a Box. And this company is established. We have very loyal fans and followers. I have really strong connections. So if I'm going to host a summit, I know I'm going to get my speakers' results. I need them to get me results as well. So in my mind, I was reaching out to people who were established, who normally I would warn my clients and students, these people are probably not going to promote. But I was like, if I'm very clear from the beginning that they need to promote at least once, I included it in the agreement, I believe. I included it right in the pitch. I had a box they had to check in their speaker information form saying yes, I understand these expectations. I thought it would work. I was hoping it would work, and it didn't. I think all of them at least reshared something that I tagged them with on social media, but very few of them sent a solo email or anything like that. And partially I expected it because it's something I tell my students all the time, big name people just aren't going to promote. But I was also just hoping that because I have the status, that sounds snobby to say, I really don't think that I'm that big of a deal. But since I have a proven business with a sizable audience, and since I had connections with these people and set these expectations so clearly, I was hoping that I would get, better results than I did, but it just didn't work, which is fine. The summit was still wonderful. And now, again, I get to use that experience to stress to our clients and students, you don't want to rely on these big name people. But of course, it was a bit of a disappointment at the time. So yeah, thinking it would work to set requirements and expect big name speakers to promote was definitely a fail. And then failure number 6 was having too many repeat speakers in one of my summits. This was either summit 5 or 6. It was the last summit I hosted for designers. And it was the year after I generated $121,000 in revenue. So I had some big goals. My goal was to match that amount of revenue. And one of my biggest strategies for that was inviting back all of the people who brought in a ton of affiliate revenue the time before. There was one speaker who brought in $15,000 in All Access Pass sales. I was like, this person's coming back. And I just did the same thing. And then, of course, went and found new speakers as well. But I had too many repeat speakers. I think it was 50%, maybe even higher than 50% of the speakers were speakers who had also been at the previous summit. And they just don't go as hard the second time. They're not as invested, even if they saw great results. And our results for that summit were cut in half. I do think a big part of that was people were distracted from something that was going on in the world. And also, there were 2 very similar summits conveniently positioned a couple weeks ahead of mine. So people had started knowing when I was hosting my summit and knew to do theirs first, which is super smart of them, right? It just affected my results. But again, the people, I could see that the speakers just weren't working as hard they weren't as excited as they were for the first time. They didn't promote as hard as they did the first time. So too many repeat speakers definitely had an impact on my results, and I would consider that a fail. Now, when I repeat a summit, I would never have more than 25% as repeat speakers, in case you want to use that as a bit of a benchmark. I hope you are loving the Summit Host Hangout podcast and that you've had some big aha moments, whether this is your first episode or your 100th episode. With hundreds of episodes of this show available, I know it can be overwhelming to figure out where your time is best spent. And I know if you're hosting a summit, you don't have time to waste. So to get you on the fast track to summit success, we have curated 5 core playlists based on the type of business you run and what you're most interested in learning about, so you know exactly where to start to get the most out of this podcast. From there, you can dive into some extra playlists around topics like hosting a B2C summit, leading with your values, overcoming mindset blocks, or you can even learn from summit success stories that have been shared. So head to summitinabox.co/playlist to get access to your curated playlist of Summit Host Hangout episodes, so you can jump in with what will have the most impact for you and your business. Again, that's summitinabox.co/playlist. I hope this episode was interesting. I hope you have some takeaways and some little tips you can kind of apply to your next events. I hope you can avoid some of these mistakes that I made. And I'm so grateful that you tuned in. For show notes and any resources, head on over to the link in the episode description wherever you're listening. And in the next episode, my plan is to give you a little behind the scenes of an event I have coming up. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Now go out and take action to plan, strategize, and launch your high converting virtual summit.